I will mention even convalescent plasma. The South African variant seems to have immune escape.
Hello, I'm Faith Rogers, host of today's program, COVID-19 Keeping Up with a Moving Target. This is the February 3rd update of DKB Med Radio's Coronavirus Educational Series. Thank you for joining us. This activity is jointly provided by the Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, DKB Med, and the Institute for Johns Hopkins Nursing. Today's program is accredited for ANCC and AAPA credit, as well as AMA PRA Category 1 credits. Please visit our website for complete CE information. If you're tuning into our webcast, please click the red Claim Credit button in the webinar console to attest for credit. Otherwise, please visit covid19.dkbmed.com. Today's learning objectives are: discuss changes in SARS-CoV-2 since a Wuhan strain was identified, and discuss implications of newer variants on vaccine development. With us today, we have Dr. Paul Auwaerter, Clinical Director of the Division of Infectious Diseases at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. Thank you and welcome back, Dr. Auwaerter.
Yeah, thank you, Faith. So I thought I would start off today with two things. First, just a brief comment on some recent vaccine news that might be useful for you to know about. And the second is to dive a little deeper into the viral variants, which certainly have been in the press of late. I think most people are now familiar with the Pfizer and Moderna data, but I wanted to update you on some items for the last three vaccine rows in this chart. So Gamaleya, that's sometimes known as a Sputnik V vaccine from Russia, is a two-shot endeavor with two different strains of adenovirus. But they have just reported in the Lancet a 91.6% efficacy, which is very similar to the data which they had offered by press release earlier. It works apparently as well in the over 60-year group. I don't think we'll see this vaccine in the United States, but I wanted to just comment on it because as with most adenovirus vaccines, it can be just refrigerated for distribution, and many countries have been using it already before the phase 3 data was published, but I think there'll be a more distribution now. So that's just something to put into the calculus for the global pandemic. Now, the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine also, if it comes to the US, will be a bit down the road. Earlier data had this odd finding where a small subset of the original study had received half the dose number one, which seemed to have a better response. But because of the viral variants, which we'll get to, there was pressure to hold on the second dose and extend it until later for 12 weeks. And from that initial trial experience with that strategy, AstraZeneca released data just today that there was 76% efficacy with that one dose strategy using the chimpanzee adenovirus vector, which is non-replicating. And of course, this vaccine is a bit more stable and is perhaps the lowest cost one that's projected. So lots of countries across the planet have contracted with them to get doses. The newest kid on the block with recent data just released is the Janssen vaccine, which also uses adeno 26. And this is a very rare adenovirus for human infection. And that's important. So hopefully people don't have pre-existing immunity to the adenovirus vector. So it can truly concentrate on the spike protein and not get waylaid by the adenovirus component. It is just one dose, which of course is a big help logistically. However, it really overall did not do quite as well as the mRNA vaccines at 66%. It fared a bit well higher in the United States, but in South Africa, where the predominant strain during this trial was the viral variant, which we'll get to a bit later, had lower efficacy at 57%. But importantly, severe COVID-19 was avoided in 85% of people. And so I think this is hugely important if it can expand the supply. It may not be quite as efficacious for preventing severe COVID-19 as the mRNA vaccines, but certainly has a fit right now to help staunch the pandemic. It also only needs to be refrigerated. I put in the estimated cost. That's the Operation Warp Speed purchase price there. What it will be for other countries, I cannot say. So the virus variants have been in the news for a while, and I think anyone who's done HIV care is very used to discussing mutations and variants, but it's probably new for really being at the forefront for general practices. But it is something that is being paid close attention. And here you have a cartoon of the SARS-CoV genome. And the United Kingdom really had included routine testing of the virus, genetic sequencing, which has only been done sporadically in the United States until very recently. So now there's a huge effort to try to do this. And basically, the countries that have been looking for issues have sort of come up with these variants, which we'll talk more about. One, which sometimes is referred to as a UK strain, but who knows if it really started there, and that's the B117. And the other, the B1351, first identified in South Africa. The concerns are that these seem to be produced in higher carriage in the upper respiratory tract, therefore may be more easily transmissible because you have higher viral loads. And at least for the UK experience, there's an indication that it may be more virulent. So the UK strain here has at least 23 mutations. So it really accumulated a huge amount. And the so-called E component has just also been described in it. And it's unclear. People are very nervous about this E484K, which was not in the original B117 strain, because it may be that this will decrease efficacy of the spike-based proteins. And at least, although there needs to be confirmation, there is a sense that this has resulted in more deaths in the United Kingdom given compared to earlier strains. The P1 strain, which has this E484K, was first identified in people in Japan who had been in Brazil and now seems to be in Brazil. Not yet as widely acknowledged, but one that I think is producing a lot of worry for people. And then lastly, on the bottom, the B1351, again, has similar mutations. The N501Y is one which may alter the binding of the spike protein to the ACE2 inhibitor and facilitate that bind more tightly. And this is thought to be one of the possibilities for fostering increased transmission. Now, in the United States, as I've mentioned, we really haven't looked that hard, but we've seen at least 32 states as of late January, which have reported viral variants of the UK described strain. Fewer, including our home state of Maryland, have had the strain first identified in South Africa. But the issue I would point out to everyone is which country in the world has had the highest number of COVID cases? Which country has used more remdesivir, the antiviral? Which country has used more convalescent plasma? All these could pressure virus to mutate to have either immune escape or antiviral escape. So, and the answer, of course, is the United States, but we're only beginning to have large scale sequencing. Here at Hopkins, we're sequencing up to 200 viruses per week, but much larger scale is needed. And of course, one idea is whether some of the hot spots in the United States, such as Southern California or Southern Florida, may have its own kind of viral variants. And clearly some have already been identified in Ohio and California, but are not yet studied enough to make much comment. But where we are in terms of immunizations, we are immunizing about almost 1.5 million people per day. And I think it's important because this New York Times map tells you that some smaller states are doing better than larger states, perhaps. And it gives you a percentage there, but I think it's important because this New York Times map, and one that's often replicated like that, includes the entire US population, which is about 331 million, but really there are only 220 million adults that probably should be counted in that. So I figure that at least 11.8% of the US population has received at least one dose. And that's quite meaningful because even one mRNA dose seems to offer protection and protection within about 10 days after that first jab. And importantly, nearly 23% of the prioritized population, of course, that's people over 75 or 65, depending on the state, have been immunized. So some progress is being made and it's picking up, although the vaccine supply now has been challenging, where initially was standing up places to get the vaccine and personnel. So it remains challenging from a logistic perspective. But I'd like to point out that many people are looking at Israel for a number of reasons, but primarily because it may be the laboratory for real world efficacy. Now, the vast majority of vaccine administered in this country has been the Pfizer vaccine, a much smaller percentage Moderna, but over 30% have been immunized in the last 5 weeks. So the country, and 70% of people over 60 years. And what that's yielded is a real world efficacy that's maybe calculated at 92% from the Israeli National Health Service. And this is very close to the 95% clinical trial experience, and that only a tiny percentage of people after the second vaccine have needed hospitalization. And of course, that could be for other reasons as well. I think this just highlights that even if there are viral variants, these vaccines at the moment, we are not really losing traction, at least in terms of impact on clinical disease or hospitalization. And of course, Israel has a national health service, but also an electronic vaccine registry. So they've coordinated with Pfizer to really get data. And this will be likely talked about, I should say, every week or two as more and more data is accrued. So what about these variants? So at the moment, most molecular platforms look for 2 to 3 targets, including the N protein and the open reading frame. So most molecular platforms should have no problem detecting these variants. But if it's only one target, and perhaps antigen tests could fall into this, there may be problems. So to keep an eye. In terms of treatments, no known impact yet for remdesivir, which works on the RNA polymerase of the virus. Monoclonal antibodies, though, bad news here. The 501Y-V2, that's also the South African derived variant, has complete escape. It has really no impact. But the most common strain in the United States, the 614G, and also the UK strains, the B117, both have retained activity. So, for example, the monoclonal, the bamlanivimab, which is under an emergency use right now, Eli Lilly is combining it with 2 other neutralizing antibodies that bind to different parts of the spike protein and see if this proves more effective. So that's already in trial. I will mention even convalescent plasma. The South African variant seems to have immune escape, but perhaps with high titer plasma, it may not. We're really not sure about that in detail. So why is there these problems with variants, and what's going on with so-called neutralizing antibodies, which we think is what predominantly offers protection? So we do know that the Janssen vaccine, that single dose vaccine, has reduced activity in South African patients. It looks like mRNA vaccines retain sufficient activity. We'll talk about some of this may be due to how the receptor binding domain, the RBD here on the spike protein, does seem to change position, meaning that high receptor binding means that it will bind fairly tightly and so on. But when it's in this low or lying down phase, it may evade it. And so this may be one characteristic of this trimeric protein that can foster immune evasion. And the other is, of course, these alterations in the main receptor binding domain. And this is what's thought to be the predominant neutralizing locale of antibodies. So changes there are making people very nervous. What we do know, for example, and this is just one of a number of studies, but I'll just show you, is a sera from the Moderna vaccine was studied and has no impact on the common strains of the United States or in the UK with its variant B117. But in South Africa, there seemed to be more of a reduction, as you can see here in the D in panel D. And this is similar to some other studies as well, but it's thought to still be quite sufficient for providing neutralization of the virus, but everyone is watching this quite closely. So in closing, the variants, I think if they become predominant, means that the current monoclonal antibodies, which are not as widely adopted as we hoped for treatment or even prevention yet, pending studies, may become useless, and this is important. It looks like the messenger RNA vaccines are still highly efficacious and also may have benefits of having other aspects of immunity from T cells. And lastly, companies including Pfizer and Moderna are already looking at altering their vaccine with a new product based on these changes that could be potentially used as a third booster if necessary. So I think everyone is trying to be as proactive as possible. I think this is very good, but it's a situation that bears watching as we head further into the winter and spring, although cases are declining, which is very good news overall. So thanks very much for listening this week, and hope everyone stays safe, well, and gets the vaccine as soon as they're eligible. Thank you.
Dr. Auwaerter, thank you again for those updates. If you're tuning into our webcast, please click the red Claim Credit button in the webinar console to attest for credit. Otherwise, please visit covid19.dkbmed.com. Any questions or issues, feel free to email us at the address listed. To submit questions, please send them to qa@dkbmed.com. That's Q as in question, A as in answer, at dkbmed.com. Again, thanks for joining us, and thank you for your dedication to your patients with COVID-19.